Help me welcome.
My name is Sono. I'm here representing the University of Alabama. My project is titled Off the Border, Mexican Americans in Washington State and Oral History Projects. And really quickly this morning, I just want to ask everybody a question. It's a simple question. I want you to raise your hand if you know who Cesar Chavez is. And if you're a Berkeley student, you should have your hand raised because your student center is right there. Okay, good. Now, how many of you know who Tomás Villanueva is? Nobody. Does anybody know who Ricardo Garcia is? It's a common name, but does anyone know who that is? No. Okay. Well, here's why. Here's why. Literature says that if one examines the evolution of Chicano or Chicana research in the Pacific Northwest as opposed to the Southwest, it is evident that most of the northern Chicano and Chicana scholarship developed much later. As a result, there needs to be a paradigm shift in the way people of Mexican descent and birth are studied that further encompasses their experience throughout the U.S., especially in the Pacific Northwest. This is coming from Jose Estrada, who wrote a master's thesis. So he's not, formally a scholar yet, but he's one of the few people to tackle this subject. Here's something else. Erasmo Gamboa is the foremost historian on Mexican Americans in the Pacific Northwest. This is what he had to say. This obscurity stems in large part from the fact that Northwest Chicanos are commonly overlooked in the general discourse among historians and other scholars interested in the Chicano Latino experience. Now that was written in 1995. It's 15 years later, and the literature is still not there. If I give you two examples, one book, McNair wrote a book called Occupied America. It's supposed to be the foremost textbook about Chicano history. There was one sentence about Mexican Americans in Washington State, one sentence. The book Testimonio, which is supposed to be a documentary history of Mexican American struggle for civil rights in the United States, no mentions, none. So this is where I found the motivation to do this project. I traveled to the state of Washington, to see what had gone on there. I conducted 20 interviews and collected 20 oral histories. And so this is the story of Mexican Americans in Washington State. In my research, I found 3 active communities. One is Western Washington, more specifically the city of Seattle, which holds the University of Washington, the state's flagship university. The next one is Northwest Washington. The Skagit Valley is a very agricultural rich area. They grow a lot of fruit, strawberries, bulbs, tulips, things like that. And there they have a university called Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. It's a fairly small school, fairly small state school. And the third is Eastern Washington, more specifically the Yakima Valley, which is a very agricultural rich area. And in the 1940s and 50s, there was a mass migration from mostly Texas or the Southwest up to Washington to look for steady farm work. And that is how you get a critical mass of Mexican Americans in Washington. So as I interviewed these activists, 4 themes came about. Clearly they're all aimed at dissolving social injustice for Mexican Americans, but here's 4 main ones that came out. One is to make the community more inclusive for Mexican Americans, to kind of eliminate the concept of perhaps an ethnic enclave where there's no interaction and there's animosity between racial groups. The second is to increase opportunities for Mexican Americans in higher education. The third is to gather support for farm workers' rights, which is probably the most publicized part of the Chicano movement of Mexican American activism. And the fourth is to improve access to health care, and this is important. We'll come back to that. In Western Washington, as I mentioned before, you have the University of Washington. The University of Washington is an interesting case because in 1968 was when racial issues became a hot button topic. Larry Gossett, who is the current King County Councilman, King County being the county that holds Seattle, was the president of the Black Student Union at the University of Washington in 1968. He noticed, he and his other counterparts Washington was an institutionally racist place. And they weren't saying that there were policies in place specifically to prevent minorities from enrolling there. But if you looked at the disproportionality of the people enrolled in the university and the people that were actually living in the state of Washington, it was a problem. So he organized many a sit-in, many a protest, many a petition, a letter written, and everything like that. And they came into the president's office, and they sat down with him, and he finally agreed, or maybe they held him there, but he agreed to hammer out some points of emphasis, some points of change at the University of Washington. The one which ends up coming into play probably the most for Mexican Americans is the recruitment system. Students from the Black Student Union went to Western Washington, so as I mentioned before, the Yakima Valley is a very agricultural-rich place. So they went to look for the high school students that had just graduated, that were, maybe looking to advance their education, and they helped them with admissions, and they told them, come to the University of Washington, we're starting to move, we're starting to change. So they were able to come there. As the number increased, and you had more Mexican Americans on campus, you had Mexican Americans going back to recruit their cousins, their family members, their friends, their little brothers. Then you started to gain a more critical mass, and they started to form the organization McNair, which stands for the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aslan, which is a mouthful, but you just know it by McNair. McNair was involved in many different forms of activism. One primary one that was described to me many times was the Great Boycott. And the Great Boycott has gained national attention because of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. So they were very much involved in that. This is a newspaper article from the University of Washington's daily newspaper describing the Great Boycott supporters. Every day, they were outside of the Safeway stores on the Ave, which is the main drag over in Seattle, talking to grocery store owners and talking to shoppers and encouraging them not to buy there if they were selling union grapes. They also were the first campus in the United States to eliminate non-union grapes from their campus. Outside of their student union, they stood outside and they sold people hamburgers, and they said, have this sandwich instead if you don't go inside. And they were successful in eliminating non-union grapes. So Enrique Morales, who is now the University of Washington Associate Vice President of Minority Affairs, was one of these students, spoke to me and said, if you have the kind of social consciousness, you really couldn't argue about it. And so the Great Boycott was essential in getting support across the board, from not just the Mexican Americans, from the African Americans, and the Asian Americans, and the Native Americans. Everyone across campus could really get into this and support the cause. This is a picture of Cesar Chavez. And Jesus Profe Rodriguez said that anybody that was anybody, they brought him to the University of Washington. So that means Cesar Chavez, that means famous playwright Luis Valdez, who wrote the play Zoot Suit. Dolores Huerta, who was Cesar Chavez's kind of right-hand woman. They all came to the University of Washington. But I want to propose something else. Anybody that was anybody in the movement was at the University of Washington. So that goes beyond. Another important movement in Seattle was the formation of a community center called El Centro de la Raza. And what happened was the city of Seattle had an old abandoned school called the Beacon School. And El Centro founder, Rebecca Maestas, was a teacher, an ESL teacher, in the Seattle community college system. And he faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of funding cuts, and people telling him that you can't speak Spanish in this building when he's teaching an ESL class. So he decided that he needed to change. He needed to take his business somewhere else and to be able to educate the population as he wanted to. So he walked into this school and he occupied it for days, weeks, over a month. And he took students from the University of Washington, primarily from NENJA, also from an organization called the Brown Berets. They all went to this school and they occupied it until finally they reached an agreement with the city. The city agreed to rent it to them for $1 a month. $1 a month was their rent. So Rogelio Riojas was the executive director of CMAR, which is a community health organization. Said it was the students themselves. We went in there, we stayed for lots of nights, some of us in classes, for a couple of weeks, and some longer. All of that was done